The evening Marion Crawford walked into Princess Elizabeth's night nursery for the first time, she found a 6-year-old girl lying in bed with the cords of her dressing gown tied to the bedpost, using them as reins. The little girl was driving an imaginary team of horses. She looked up at Crawford's Eton-cropped hair and asked, with the directness of a child who had never been told no by anyone who mattered, "Why have you no hair?" It was an evening in 1933. The nursery was on the top floor of 145 Piccadilly, a tall, narrow townhouse near Hyde Park Corner, topped with a glass dome through which London's light filtered down in the evenings. Below the dome, 30 wooden toy horses stood in a row, unsaddled every night by the same 2 pairs of hands, fed imaginary hay, watered from imaginary buckets. Downstairs, the Duke and Duchess of York kept their domestic life, dinners at 8, quiet evenings by the fire, the Duke embroidering chair seats in petty point with genuine concentration. In the nursery, above all of it, the future Queen of England asked a 23-year-old Scottish governess why she had no hair. Crawford had trained in child psychology at Moray House Training College in Edinburgh. She had planned a career working with disadvantaged children in the city's poorer districts, children from the grass market and the cowgate, children who actually needed the professional education she had spent years accumulating. She had taken a temporary tutoring job with Lord Elgin's household, then a placement looking after the daughter of Lady Rose Levison Gower. One afternoon, Lady Rose asked her to come and meet her sister, the Duchess of York. Nothing was said at the time. A fortnight later, Lady Rose told Crawford the Duchess would like her to be governess to the princesses. Crawford was 23 years old. The career in Edinburgh's poorer districts was set aside. She accepted a position in a household that would be her entire world for the next 16 years, and whose matriarch would spend the 38 years after that ensuring the world forgot she had ever been there. She wasn't the household's nanny. That role belonged to Clara Knight, called Alla, a woman who had actually been nanny to the Duchess herself and who ran the physical care of the children, their baths, their health, their clothing, their mornings and bedtimes. Alla was assisted by 2 sisters, Margaret MacDonald and Ruby MacDonald. Margaret, called Bobo, would eventually become so embedded in Princess Elizabeth's life that she served as her personal dresser for 67 years. The household structure was clear and deliberately maintained. Alla and the MacDonalds had charge of the children's physical existence. Crawford had charge of their minds. She supervised the girls from 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening, 9 daily hours in which she taught Bible, history, grammar, arithmetic, geography, literature, poetry, music, drawing, and composition. Beyond the formal curriculum, which the Duke and Duchess didn't particularly prioritize, and which the Queen frequently interrupted by simply walking in, Crawford was the consistent adult presence in both girls' days, the one who was there when the parents weren't, who answered the questions the parents were too exhausted or too distracted to field. The domestic texture of life at 145 Piccadilly comes through Crawford's memoir in unusual detail. Each morning began not with lessons, but with a session in the Duke and Duchess's bedroom, the girls tumbling in early, what Crawford described as hijinks, an unholy din of loud laughter that the whole house could hear before breakfast. Tea happened every afternoon at 5 o'clock and routinely dissolved into boisterous games of racing demon, played with complete seriousness and considerable noise. Bath time produced its own nightly uproar, shrieking, splashing, pillow fights. The first corgi, a bad-tempered creature called Dookie, arrived in 1933 and was installed in the nurseries upstairs, where he immediately bit anyone who irritated him. On the top floor under the glass dome, the 30 wooden horses stood in their row, and every evening, without exception, the girls unsaddled them and pretended to water and feed them, a routine maintained with the gravity of real stable work. Elizabeth and Margaret were, in Crawford's detailed account, almost comically unlike each other in temperament. Elizabeth was conscientious, disciplined, and possessed of a neatness that went past tidiness into something more compulsive. She straightened her shoes before going to bed, organized her belongings with a precision that occasionally concerned Crawford. Her self-control was, for a child, exceptional, and it broke perhaps twice in Crawford's record. The most vivid occasion? During a lesson on French irregular verbs, Elizabeth picked up a silver ink pot and emptied the entire contents over her own head, then sat perfectly still as the blue ink ran down through her blonde curls and across her face. Margaret, born in 1930, was the counterweight. Mischievous, quick-tempered, funny in a way that was almost aggressive, a natural entertainer who had been running along behind her sister since she was old enough to walk, calling, "Wait for me, Lilibet! Wait for me!" Crawford watched these girls through the most consequential years of their childhood. When Edward VIII announced his abdication in December 1936, Crawford was given the task of explaining the situation to the children. Elizabeth was 10 years old. She heard that her father had become king and that they would be moving to Buckingham Palace, and she asked, "What, forever?" Margaret, aged 6, received the news and said, "But I have only just learnt to write York." Crawford was with them through that transition and through everything that followed. The move to Buckingham Palace was a shock after 145 Piccadilly. "Life in a palace rather resembles camping in a museum," Crawford wrote. "These historic places are so old, so tied up with tradition, that they are mostly dropping to bits." The corridors were endless. The bedrooms were shabby. Then came the war, which was the most demanding period of Crawford's tenure and the most revealing about her actual function within the household. Windsor Castle in the early 1940s was a particular version of grandeur stripped to its essentials. Windows shattered by blast damage and boarded over with plywood, corridors unheated and dark through multiple winters, vast rooms shut and unused, the palace's staff depleted by conscription. The wooden horses had been left behind at 145 Piccadilly, which was eventually destroyed by bombing. Air raid warnings broke the nights irregularly, not on any schedule a child could predict or prepare for, and the princesses grew accustomed to being walked down to the castle's dungeons to wait out the worst of it, sleeping on whatever could be arranged on the stone floors below ground. The king and queen moved through the war's enormous demands, consumed and exhausted in ways that left them present at the public level and absent at the daily one. Crawford was, in practice, the consistent adult presence for both girls through 5 winters of that reality. She organized pantomimes to give the princesses something to do. She ran girl guides. She managed the 1,000 daily details of 2 children's emotional lives in conditions of genuine austerity and genuine danger. George VI acknowledged what this meant directly. He told Crawford, "We couldn't carry on if you weren't here." That wasn't a ceremonial formulation. The king was, by Crawford's own description, emotionally guarded, uncomfortable with demonstrations of affection even from his daughters. When he said those words, he meant them precisely. Crawford had already postponed her own marriage twice because the family's circumstances made her departure inconvenient, and the implicit expectation, never stated outright, but maintained consistently, was that she would stay until the family no longer needed her. She did. In July 1947, Crawford finally married George Boothleigh, an Aberdeen bank manager she had known for years, at the age of 38. She had spent 16 years of her adult life in this household, from the morning sessions at 145 Piccadilly to the wartime dungeons at Windsor. 2 months after her wedding, on 20 November 1947, Princess Elizabeth married Prince Philip at Westminster Abbey. Crawford attended. In 1949, she formally retired. The family's parting gestures were, by any external measure, substantial and meaningful. Crawford was awarded the Commander of the Royal Victorian Order. She received a pension. Most significantly, She was given Nottingham Cottage, a grace and favor residence within the grounds of Kensington Palace, furnished personally by Queen Mary with antiques and flower prints as an additional gesture of appreciation. These gifts said something plain. A family that regarded Crawford as a retired professional employee would have given her a reference and a cash settlement. Instead, Queen Mary arranged the furnishings herself. The cottage was a form of testimony about what 16 years of service had meant to the people who received it. That cottage would be taken back inside the year. The broad outline of what happened next isn't disputed. The story of Marion Crawford has been documented in biographies, in a Channel 4 documentary in 2000, and in multiple academic accounts. What those accounts have been less direct about is the precise naming of agency. Not the palace as a diffuse institution, not the royal family as a collective noun, but the specific person who decided that Marion Crawford would cease to exist within their world. That person was the Queen Mother. What she did wasn't institutional protocol. It was a sustained personal decision, documented in her own handwriting and enforced for the rest of Crawford's life. In 1949, Bruce and Beatrice Gould, editors of the American mass circulation magazine Ladies' Home Journal, approached Buckingham Palace and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office seeking royal stories for transatlantic publication. The palace declined. The British government, interested in American goodwill, suggested a different route. Marion Crawford, the recently retired governess of the princesses. From the government's perspective, Crawford was a private citizen with a story worth telling. The offer that reached Crawford was somewhere between $6,500 and $85,000, depending on the account. Her husband, George Boothleigh, who had an instinct for capitalizing on available assets and no particular deference to royal convention, urged her strongly to accept. Crawford went to the Queen Mother for advice. "That is worth holding for a moment," she asked. She wasn't sneaking. She went to the woman who had employed her for 16 years and asked whether she should proceed. The Queen Mother's reply arrived on 4th April 1949. Her words were exact. She stated she felt most definitely that Crawford shouldn't write and sign articles about the children, that people in positions of confidence with the family must be utterly discreet, and that if Crawford, the moment she finished teaching Margaret, started writing about her and Princess Elizabeth, they should never feel confidence in anyone again. A qualified alternative followed. Crawford could assist anonymously as a background advisor to a journalist named Dermot Mora, who had been selected to produce articles using her help, as long as Crawford's name didn't appear, as long as she didn't take the American money. The Queen Mother was direct. Crawford must resist the allure of American money and persistent editors and say no. Crawford signed a contract with the Goulds that contained a clause allowing publication without royal consent and under her own name. Whether she understood herself to have secured some form of limited permission from the Queen Mother's qualified approval of the anonymous arrangement, a reading she perhaps stretched, or whether she made a deliberate choice to proceed against explicit written instruction, the contract says what it says. The Queen Mother had written most definitely that Crawford shouldn't proceed. Crawford had signed without her consent. In the autumn of 1949, Lady Astor forwarded the completed manuscript to the Queen Mother for review. The Queen Mother read it. She found it shockingly frank. She was particularly disturbed by Crawford's account of the king's emotional discomfort with physical affection from his daughters, by the extended discussion of Prince Philip's courtship, by the intimacy of domestic detail throughout. She sent the American publishers her annotated manuscript, requesting specific passages be removed, and told them directly that Crawford had gone off her head. The Goulds had put too much money into the project to stop it. They kept the Queen Mother's objections from Crawford and published it anyway. The articles appeared in Ladies' Home Journal in early 1950. Woman's Own paid £30,000 for the British serialization rights. Later that year, the material became a book, The Little Princesses, published by Cassell and Company in London and Harcourt, Brace and Company in New York. By any measure of public reception, it was a sensation. The book's contents are essential to understanding what follows, because punishment requires comparison. The little princesses described Princess Elizabeth as serious, conscientious, and almost obsessively tidy. It described Princess Margaret as mischievous and funny, a natural entertainer. It described morning sessions in the parents' bedroom, racing demon at tea time, the 30 wooden horses under the glass dome, the bad-tempered Dookie biting anyone who annoyed him. It described wartime Windsor, cold corridors, boarded-up windows, the dungeons. It described the princess's reactions to the abdication, Elizabeth's, "What? Forever?" Margaret's quip about learning to write, "York." It described Prince Philip's courtship with warmth the palace found presumptuous. Historian Jane Ridley, who read the memoir closely while researching her own biography of the late Queen, characterized the disclosures as groundbreaking in their candid, albeit extremely flattering portrayal, and harmless in the extreme. The worst thing Crawford reveals, in Ridley's assessment, is that the princesses occasionally squabbled physically when they were angry with each other. Adrian Tinniswood, writing for Time magazine, called it gossipy but quite innocuous. The book was, by any modern standard, a love letter. Crawford had more information than she used. She had 16 years of daily observation, and she disclosed what amounted to charming domestic warmth. What she kept to herself, the king's private fears, the queen's complicated relationships, the household tensions that a woman living inside a family for 16 years inevitably witnesses, she kept. There were genuine transgressions by the mid-20th century royal standard. Crawford speculated about whether the king and queen had wished for a son. She wrote about the king's emotional guardedness in ways the family found intimate and unwanted. By the royal household's governing principle, nothing disclosed, ever, regardless of how warm, Crawford had broken the fundamental rule. The breach was real. Hugo Vickers's research into the book's production history also surfaced something that complicates the standard narrative. The Goulds had taken Crawford's material and rewritten it substantially until it suited their commercial purposes. Incidents were inserted that had never happened. Words were put in mouths that had not said them. Crawford had reportedly feared serious distortions in the final text. The book that destroyed her wasn't, in certain passages, entirely hers. The Queen Mother had this information available to her. It changed nothing. The Queen Mother severed all contact with Crawford immediately. Not after a period of cooling, not through an intermediary, not following any discussion about what had happened and what was expected. The switch was thrown at once. Crawford was required to vacate Nottingham Cottage in the autumn of 1950, the Grace and Favour residence within the grounds of Kensington Palace, furnished personally by Queen Mary, given as a measure of what 16 years had meant, was withdrawn. Crawford packed her belongings and left London, left the geography of her working life, left the proximity to the family that had been her entire adult world, and relocated to Aberdeen. The eviction from that cottage couldn't have happened without a direct instruction from the household. The Grace and Favour tenure rested entirely on royal goodwill, and the royal goodwill had been withdrawn. Someone ordered it withdrawn. The Conversation, an academic journal, attributes the mechanism directly. The Queen Mother was, by all accounts, totally horrified by the book's disclosures. She immediately severed all ties and forms of communication with Crawford, who never again spoke to the royal family. Time magazine's account frames it collectively but arrives at the same place. Queen Elizabeth and her daughters were furious. They severed all contact with their old governess, who became a non-person within the royal circle, a traitor, a betrayer of confidences. Within the palace, Acts of royal household betrayal now had a name. Doing a croffy entered the household's vocabulary as the term for servants who disclosed private information for money. Crawford's name became, within the institution, a verb for what must not be done. That is a particular kind of destruction, not just the punishment of a person, but the conversion of her name into a warning, encoded permanently into the institution's informal language. The strongest version of the palace's defense deserves a fair hearing. Crawford was warned not to publish, in writing, in the most direct terms available. She proceeded against that written instruction. The royal household's code of absolute discretion, understood by everyone who enters it, expected to operate for life, had been violated. The anger wasn't manufactured, it was earned. The question isn't whether the anger was legitimate. The question is whether what the anger produced, eviction, total severance, no contact for 38 years, no acknowledgement at death, was proportionate to the offense. Crawford had lost the cottage, lost her professional standing, withdrawn entirely from public life. By any reasonable accounting of cause and consequence, within a few years of publication, the debt had been settled. She had paid. The punishment didn't end when the debt was settled. It ran for 38 years. Crawford and Buthley settled in Aberdeen, buying a house using the earnings from the book and the magazine's serialization rights. The only material benefit she would ever derive from 16 years in the household. Crawford refused every media request after the move. She produced a column for Woman's Own through the early 1950s, wrote books under her name on Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth II, and Princess Margaret, then largely withdrew from public life. She never again held a position equivalent to the one she had left. The mechanism of that exclusion is inferable from the circumstances. No aristocratic household or private school in Britain would engage an educator whose name was the palace's synonym for betrayal, without a reference from that palace. The reference wasn't coming. The household she had served was, through these same years, thriving in the public eye. The Queen Mother became, across the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, one of the most beloved public figures in Britain, the warm grandmother of the nation, the woman who had faced the Blitz smiling, the indomitable spirit who never seemed to diminish. Her public warmth wasn't fabricated. Multiple biographical accounts describe it as genuine and consistent. She remembered names. She radiated care. The love in her public performance was real. It didn't extend down the Balmoral Road. Multiple secondary sources confirm at least one suicide attempt in the years following her husband's death. The note she left spoke of a world that had passed her by, and of those she loved passing her by on the road. She meant the road to Balmoral. She was precise about it. As adults, Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret should have gone to Croffy to see how she was doing. That sentence, which appears in assessments of this episode, isn't sentiment. It names the minimum obligation. A woman who gave 16 years to these two people, who delayed her own marriage for years at the family's implicit request, who kept two children calm through wartime winters in Windsor's dungeons, who explained the abdication to a 10-year-old girl, who wrote about them afterward with nothing but warmth, was owed at minimum a letter, a card, a single line acknowledging that the relationship had existed. Nothing came. In 38 years, nothing came. Crawford wasn't the only person subjected to this treatment. Placing her case within the documented character of the person who imposed it isn't a distraction. It's essential, because it establishes that what happened to Crawford wasn't an aberration, but a pattern. The most thoroughly documented parallel runs through Wallis Simpson. From the abdication of December 1936 until Wallis Simpson's death in April 1986, the Queen Mother maintained an unbroken antagonism that wasn't merely personal distaste, but active, sustained policy. She worked throughout those 50 years to ensure Wallis never received the title HRH, a campaign requiring consistent institutional effort. She referred to her, in recorded private conversations, as that woman. Her view, never revised, was that the abdication had forced a reluctant and constitutionally ill-equipped man onto a throne that shortened his life, and Wallis Simpson was responsible for that. The antagonism ran for 50 years and resolved only when Wallis Simpson died. The Queen Mother had outlasted her adversary, which appears to have been the point. The Wallis Simpson case establishes something factual about the Queen Mother's character. She was capable of sustaining a position against another person for half a century without softening, without private acknowledgement that time might change the calculus, without any of the gradual erosion of grievance that most people experience. She maintained positions because she chose to maintain them, and she had the discipline to keep choosing. Crawford was, by any proportionate measure, a much smaller case than Wallis Simpson. Wallis Simpson had, in the Queen Mother's accounting, cost her something genuinely large: her husband's health, his comfort, perhaps his life. Whatever the truth of that attribution, the injury she perceived was real and substantial. Crawford's offense was that she had written an affectionate book about 2 children she had raised. The instrument the Queen Mother applied to a genuine adversary, total, permanent, unrelenting exclusion, she applied with the same force to a woman whose most damaging disclosure was that the princesses sometimes fought with each other. Hugo Vickers's 2005 biography of the Queen Mother, the most authoritative non-official account of her life, quotes Stephen Tennant's observation of the woman behind the public warmth. Tennant watched the Queen Mother over years from inside her social world, and his assessment was precise. Behind her outward appearance of gentleness and grace, she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. That characterization does not contradict the evidence of genuine public warmth. Both things were simultaneously true. The Queen Mother who waved to enormous crowds with what appeared to be authentic delight was the same Queen Mother who enforced a 38-year silence against the woman who had given her daughters their childhood. The warmth was real. The hardness was real. They coexisted without apparent tension. The novelist and researcher Wendy Holden, who spent considerable time investigating Crawford's life for her 2020 novel, described the treatment as symptomatic of the ruthless and brutal cold-heartedness with which the royal family responds to perceived betrayal. That phrase, cold-heartedness, captures something specific and accurate. It isn't anger. Anger exhausts itself over months or years. Cold-heartedness sustains itself indefinitely, which is what the Crawford record demonstrates. Not the heat of genuine ongoing grievance, but the deliberate maintenance of a position long after any genuine grievance had been fully satisfied. The pattern runs through multiple documented instances. Crawford was, in this accounting, not an anomaly, but a representative example. The most intimate and the most disproportionate, because this was the woman who had raised the Queen Mother's daughters. It was a closer relationship than any other victim of this treatment could claim. The application of the same instrument to someone with that degree of intimacy, for a cause of this relative smallness, reveals what the instrument actually was. It wasn't justice. It was character. Marion Crawford died at Hawkhill House Nursing Home in Aberdeen on 11 February 1988. She was 78 years old. She had spent the last decade of her life in deliberate, chosen privacy, refusing every interview, maintaining the silence she had kept since 1950, living in a world that had, as her own note put it, passed her by. At the moment of her death, the Queen Mother was 87 years old and still making regular public appearances, still the most popular member of the royal family by every available public measure. Queen Elizabeth II had been queen for 36 years. Princess Margaret was 57. All three were alive, aware, and had access to the information that Marion Crawford had died. The palace employed people who managed precisely this kind of record, who tracked the lives of senior former household members, who knew when they died. The royal family sent no representative to the funeral. No wreath arrived from the Queen Mother, or Princess Margaret. No statement was issued by the palace. No message of condolence reached Crawford's family from the household that had employed her for 16 years, given her a grace and favor home within the grounds of Kensington Palace, and awarded her the Commander of the Royal Victorian Order. Hugo Vickers, in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography entry for Crawford, states it plainly. No member of the royal family sent a message of condolence to her funeral. Wendy Holden's research is more specific. Neither the Queen Mother, nor Princess Margaret sent a wreath. 38 years had not produced confusion about who Marion Crawford was. The passage of nearly 4 decades had not softened the position, had not generated ambiguity, had not produced any impulse toward acknowledgement. What those 38 years had produced was a decision, maintained with complete consistency through Crawford's depression, through her suicide attempt, and through her death itself, to act as though she had never existed. The absence at the funeral wasn't an institutional oversight, not a gap in someone's diary management. It was the final application of a decision made in 1950 and maintained every year since. The silence was the punishment. The punishment never concluded. Crawford served the royal household for 16 years, from 1933 to 1949. From the publication of The Little Princesses in 1950 to her death in February 1988, 38 years of silence, more than twice the length of the service. If the punishment had been proportionate, if it had reflected what a genuine breach of confidence actually required, it would have concluded when the debt was paid. The debt was paid well within the first decade. She had lost the cottage, lost her professional standing, lost the world that had constituted her adult life. She had kept to herself for 38 years everything else she knew. She had published warmly once, been punished for it permanently, and then maintained a discretion that far exceeded anything she owed. Nothing came back. From publication in 1950 to the Queen Mother's death on 30 March 2002 at Royal Lodge, Windsor, 52 years. More than 3 times the length of Crawford's service. The Queen Mother died at 3:15 in the afternoon, aged 101, without having sent a word toward Marion Crawford in those 52 years, apparently without finding that remarkable. The obituaries that appeared in the days after the Queen Mother's death reached for the warmest available formulations. The phrase that circulated most persistently, most beloved, captured something genuine about the public persona. The warmth of the wave, the unbreakable smile through the worst years of the war, the authentic interest in people she encountered across 6 decades of public life. The love in the public record of her life was real and genuinely felt by millions. None of that is in dispute. What the obituaries didn't carry, because obituaries don't carry these things, was the private arithmetic. The woman the world called beloved had spent 52 years ensuring that the woman who had educated her children died as though she had never mattered. Marion Crawford, born 5 June 1909, died 11 February 1988, Hawkhill House Nursing Home, Aberdeen. No royal representative in attendance. No wreath from any member of the household she had served. George VI had told her she was irreplaceable. Queen Mary had furnished her cottage with antiques as a personal gesture of regard. The Victorian Order had certified her loyal service. Then she published an affectionate book about 2 children she had raised from 6 years old, and the family that called itself beloved spent the rest of her life, and 14 years past it, acting as though she had never existed. The evidence for what happened and who decided it's documented. The letter of April 1949 in the Queen Mother's own handwriting. The annotation of the manuscript. The instruction to Lady Astor. The description of Crawford to American publishers as someone who had gone off her head. The eviction from Nottingham Cottage. And then 38 years of enforced silence that ended only when Crawford herself did. The Queen Mother was responsible, not the palace as an institution, not the royal family as a collective, not the diffuse machinery of protocol. The Queen Mother. She made the decision, documented it, enforced it, and maintained it until Crawford's death and beyond. She served 16 years. She was punished for 38. The punishment outlived the woman it was meant to punish, and the family called itself beloved. Subscribe for more stories like this.